10 years later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 35. Fontainebleau. For 4 days, every kind of enchantment brought together in the magnificent gardens of Fontainebleau had converted this spot into a place of the most perfect enjoyment. M. Colbert seemed gifted with ubiquity. In the morning, there were the accounts of the previous night's expenses to settle; during the day, programmes, essays, enrolments, payments. M. Colbert had amassed 4 millions of francs, and dispersed them with sleepless economy. He was horrified at the expenses which mythology involved. Not a wood nymph nor a dryad that cost less than 100 francs a day. The dress alone amounted to 300 francs. The expense of powder and sulphur for fireworks amounted, every night, to 100,000 francs. In addition to these, the illuminations on the borders of the sheet of water cost 30,000 francs every evening. The fêtes had been magnificent, and Colbert could not restrain his delight. From time to time he noticed Madame and the king setting forth on hunting expeditions, or preparing for the reception of different fantastic personages solemn ceremonials which had been extemporized a fortnight before, and in which Madame's sparkling wit and the king's magnificence were equally well displayed. For Madame, the heroine of the fête, replied to the addresses of the deputations from unknown races, Garamanths, Scythians, Hyperboreans, Caucasians, and Patagonians, who seemed to issue from the ground for the purpose of approaching her with their congratulations, and upon every representative of these races the king bestowed a diamond, or some other article of value. Then the deputies, in verses more or less amusing, compared the king to the sun, Madame to Phoebe, the sun's sister, and the queen and Monsieur were no more spoken of than if the king had married Henrietta of England and not Maria Theresa of Austria. The happy pair, hand in hand, imperceptibly pressing each other's fingers, drank in deep draughts the sweet beverage of adulation, by which the attractions of youth, beauty, power, and love are enhanced. Every one at Fontainebleau was amazed at the extent of the influence which Madame had so rapidly acquired over the king, and whispered among themselves that Madame was, in point of fact, the true queen. And in effect, the king himself proclaimed its truth by his every thought, word, and look. He formed his wishes, he drew his inspirations from Madame's eyes, and his delight was unbounded when Madame deigned to smile upon him. And was Madame, on her side, intoxicated with the power she wielded, as she beheld every one at her feet? This was a question she herself could hardly answer, but what she did know was, that she could frame no wish, and that she felt herself to be perfectly happy. The result of all these changes, the source of which emanated from the royal will, was that Monsieur, instead of being the second person in the kingdom, had, in reality, become the third. And it was now far worse than in the time when De Guiche's guitars were heard in Madame's apartments, for then, at least, Monsieur had the satisfaction of frightening those who had annoyed him. Since the departure, however, of the enemy, who had been driven away by means of his alliance with the king, Monsieur had to submit to a burden, heavier, but in a very different sense, to his former one. Every evening Madame returned home quite exhausted. Horse riding, bathing in the Seine, spectacles, dinners under the leafy covert of the trees, balls on the banks of the Grand Canal, concerts, etc., etc. All this would have been sufficient to have killed, not a slight and delicate woman, but the strongest porter in the chateau. It is perfectly true that, with regard to dancing, concerts, and promenades, and such matters, a woman is far stronger than the most robust of porters. But, however great a woman's strength may be, there is a limit to it. She cannot hold out long under such a system. As for Monsieur, he had not even the satisfaction of witnessing Madame's abdication of her royalty in the evening, for she lived in the royal pavilion with the young queen and the queen mother. As a matter of course, the Chevalier de Lorraine did not quit Monsieur, and did not fail to distil drops of gall into every wound the latter received. The result was, that Monsieur, who had first been in the highest spirits, and completely restored since Guiche's departure, subsided into his melancholy state 3 days after the court was installed at Fontainebleau. It happened, however, that one day, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Monsieur, who had risen late, and had bestowed upon his toilet more than his usual attention, it happened, we repeat, that Monsieur, who had not heard of any plans having been arranged for the day, formed the project of collecting his own court, and of carrying Madame off with him to Moret, where he possessed a charming country house. He accordingly went to the queen's pavilion, and was astonished, on entering, to find none of the royal servants in attendance. Quite alone, therefore, he entered the rooms, a door on the left opening to Madame's apartment, the one on the right to the young queen's. In his wife's apartment, Monsieur was informed by a sempstress who was working there, that every one had left at 11 o'clock, for the purpose of bathing in the Seine, that a grand fête was to be made of the expedition, and that all the carriages had been placed at the park gates, and that they had all set out more than an hour ago. "Very good," said Monsieur. "The idea is a good one. The heat is very oppressive, and I have no objection to bathe too." He summoned his servants, but no one came. He summoned those in attendance on Madame, but every one had gone out. He went to the stables, where he was informed by a groom that there were no more carriages of any description. He desired that a couple of horses should be saddled, one for himself and the other for his valet. The groom told him that all the horses had been sent away. Monsieur, pale with anger, again descended towards the queen's apartments, and penetrated as far as Anne of Austria's oratory, where he perceived, through the half-open tapestry hangings, his young and beautiful sister on her knees before the queen mother, who appeared weeping bitterly. He had not been either seen or heard. He cautiously approached the opening, and listened, the sight of so much grief having aroused his curiosity. Not only was the young queen weeping, but she was complaining also. "Yes," she said, "the king neglects me. The king devotes himself to pleasures and amusements only, in which I have no share." "Patience, patience, my daughter," said Anne of Austria, in Spanish, and then, also in Spanish, added some words of advice, which Monsieur did not understand. The queen replied by accusations, mingled with sighs and sobs, among which Monsieur often distinguished the word banos, which Maria Theresa accented with spiteful anger. "The baths," said Monsieur to himself. "It seems it is the baths that have put her out." And he endeavored to put together the disconnected phrases which he had been able to understand. It was easy to guess that the queen was complaining bitterly, and that, if Anne of Austria did not console her, she at least endeavored to do so. Monsieur was afraid to be detected listening at the door, and he therefore made up his mind to cough. The two queens turned round at the sound, and Monsieur entered. At sight of the prince, the young queen rose precipitately, and dried her tears. Monsieur, however, knew the people he had to deal with too well, and was naturally too polite to remain silent, and he accordingly saluted them. The queen mother smiled pleasantly at him, saying, "What do you want, Philip?" "I? Nothing," stammered Monsieur. "I was looking for—" "Whom?" "I was looking for Madame." "Madame is at the baths." "And the king?" said Monsieur, in a tone which made the queen tremble. "The king also, the whole court as well," replied Anne of Austria. "Except you, madame," said Monsieur. "Oh, I?" said the young queen. "I seem to terrify all those who amuse themselves." "And so do I, judging from appearances," rejoined Monsieur. Anne of Austria made a sign to her daughter-in-law, who withdrew, weeping. Monsieur's brows contracted, as he remarked aloud, "What a cheerless house! What do you think of it, mother?" "Why, no, every one here is pleasure hunting." "Yes, indeed, that is the very thing which makes those dull who do not care for pleasure." "In what a tone you say that, Philip!" "Upon my word, madame, I speak as I think." "Explain yourself. What is the matter?" "Ask my sister-in-law, rather, who, just now, was detailing all her grievances to you." "Her grievances! What?" "Yes, I was listening, accidentally I confess, but still I listened, so that I heard only too well my sister complain of those famous baths of Madame." "Ah, folly!" "No, no, no. People are not always foolish when they weep. The queen said banos, which means baths." "I repeat, Philip," said Anne of Austria, "that your sister is childishly jealous." "In that case, madame," replied the prince, "I, too, must with great humility accuse myself of possessing the same defect." "You also, Philip?" "Certainly." "Are you really jealous of these baths?" "And why not, madame? When the king goes to the baths with my wife, and does not take the queen?" "Why not? When Madame goes to the baths with the king, and does not do me the honor to even invite me?" "And you enjoin my sister-in-law to be satisfied, and require me to be satisfied too?" "You are raving, my dear Philip," said Anne of Austria. "You have driven the Duke of Buckingham away. You have been the cause of M. de Guiche's exile. Do you now wish to send the king away from Fontainebleau?" "I do not pretend to anything of the kind, madame," said Monsieur, bitterly; "but at least I can withdraw, and I shall do so." "Jealous of the king? Jealous of your brother?" "Yes, madame, I am jealous of the king, of my own brother, and remarkably jealous too." "Really, monsieur," exclaimed Anne of Austria, affecting to be indignant, "I begin to believe that you are mad, and a sworn enemy to my repose. I therefore abandon the place to you, for I have no means of defending myself against such monomanias." She arose, and left Monsieur a prey to the most extravagant transport of passion. He remained for a moment, completely bewildered; then, recovering himself, again went to the stables, found the groom, once more asked him for a carriage or a horse, and upon his reply that there was neither the one or the other, Monsieur snatched a long whip from the hands of a stable boy, and began to pursue the poor devil of a groom all round the servants' courtyard, whipping him the while in spite of his cries and excuses. Then, quite out of breath, covered with perspiration and trembling in every limb, he returned to his own apartments, broke in pieces some beautiful specimens of porcelain, and then got into bed, booted and spurred as he was, crying out for some one to come to him. Chapter 36.